Preet, I want to thank you for speaking to us here at Brookings as part of our conference on the state of the rule of law. Where are we now, and where are we headed?
It's good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. If we were to use hurricane categories to describe the threat level to the rule of law in America now, ranging from 1 to 5, 5 being the most dangerous, what's your assessment?
Yeah, I don't like to put numbers to things, although I, in my office, would often have people rate the probabilities of things or how bad things were on a scale of 1 to 10 to give them more options.
You can do 1 to 10 also.
So I'm not going to do a number, but I think it's bad. I think we're clearly in a hurricane of sorts, with the possibility of things getting worse. It's a little bit, you know what it's a little bit like? To maintain your hurricane example, but without providing you a number. You know when the meteorologists start talking about a hurricane forming, and then the hurricane has formed, but it's not clear if that hurricane is going to pass over, where you live, your community, or your state. I think we're there. It's a very, very serious hurricane. Are we belaboring this too much? But it's sort of offshore. There's some rain. Is it going to veer back out to the ocean if good people do a good thing? Or is it going to come back and inundate populated communities and cause destruction and terrible things and massive loss of life? I don't know yet. And I think part of what I want to congratulate you on, and part of what I try to spend some of my time doing with the Brennan Center on this task force that I'm chairing with Christy Todd Whitman, former governor from New Jersey, is try to send that hurricane back over the water.
I have the Brennan Center task force
it's very lovely,
proposals
right?
for reform, fresh out. I commend them to everybody's reading.
Please.
And they do explain the hurricane prevention plan.
Yeah, they solve everything. You have this, and your home will stay completely dry.
So this is, folks, hurricane insurance.
Yes.
You heard it from the man himself. What are the elements of the threats to the rule of law in America today, as you see them, the principal elements?
Well, there's a lot of things, right? What people, I think, forget is there are some things that I think we don't have to worry about so much. The judiciary, people worry that it's under attack because the president from time to time, tweets about a particular judge and denigrates a particular jurist by name, and that's terrible. And I think everyone who's reasonable, whether you are in the practice of law or not, thinks that's not a good idea to put pressure on people in that way and single them out, and sometimes they get death threats. That's terrible, and no one condones it. I don't think, however, that in the long run, in a more significant way, is the judiciary really in trouble, right? Other than if you have a view about the kinds of judges who are being appointed to the bench, but putting that aside for a moment, the Constitution provides that federal judges serve for life, and some people don't like that, but it actually has, a very salutary effect of giving them independence, right? So they get to be independent because no matter what a president says about them, and I've talked to judges, and you and I both have friends who are members of the bench, and I've asked this question, what does it feel like? And sometimes they will say to me, look, we're all thinking we're one step away from handling a matter in a way that a president or his associate won't like, and then we'll get called out, and that's not good for us, it's not good for the kids. But at the end of the day, they're going to do their job as they see fit, as we have seen courts do time and time again, whether you're talking about the travel ban or anything else. So I'm not so worried about them.
All right, let me stop you on the judiciary, because we'll tick through the other elements, DOJ, prosecutors, the special counsel, and otherwise. But on the judiciary, what, in your view, you've worked in Congress, I know you worked in the Senate behind the scenes.
For the Judiciary Committee.
For the Judiciary Committee, and of course, you've seen the judiciary as a U.S. attorney, as a practitioner, and otherwise.
Yes.
What effect on judicial independence and on the reputation of the judiciary is the Kavanaugh fight going to have, in your view, if you know?
Spoken like a true lawyer. If you know, I don't think the rules of evidence apply here, but thanks for that caveat. I think probably bad. Someone said something very smart last week. Maybe it was you. I don't remember, on social media. That the folks who think that this is an issue, a binary issue of will Kavanaugh be on the bench or not on the Supreme Court, misses a bigger point, and it goes to the heart of your question. What is going to happen with respect to hundreds of millions of Americans' views of that court? And in the same way, just to bring back my comment about the president and the judiciary, I think they will remain independent. even though Donald Trump casts aspersions on particular judges, and I think the Supreme Court will remain, independent as far as it can be. But the problem is that kind of commentary, some of what we saw last week, the politicization of the process, the polarization of how people think about these things, the allegations some people believe and some people think are made up, is terrible for the court and terrible for people's opinion of the court, and that matters, right? I felt that way about law enforcement, and I was, somewhat outspoken and talked about what we did and why we did what we did, more than some other U.S. attorneys. And the principal reason for that was I wanted people to have faith and confidence in what we were doing. And you get into trouble, like Jim Comey did, if you try to explain too much. But there's an inclination, I think, for people to want not just justice to be done, but for justice to be seen to be done, right? That's an important premise in our system, so people have faith in it. And if more people start to think that the Supreme Court just decides cases depending on affiliation or loyalty to a president who backed that person, or it contains members who have credibly been charged with things that a lot of people believe are true, that are crimes, it's not good for the court. So I think that it's a bad thing. I don't know how we get ourselves out of it, but at the moment, the court probably, I haven't seen the recent polls, probably has a higher approval rating than some of the other branches of government, particularly Congress, who Governor Whitman recently said this morning that she thinks that Congress has a lower approval rating than a colonoscopy. Someone else said that's because you don't get anesthesia with Congress. And you'll see the court, like other institutions, falling in the same way.
A full and fair FBI investigation of the allegations is a start to clearing this cloud hanging over the nomination.
Yeah, but look, as you and I know, having played in this field, you don't always get a clear answer, right? So investigations are good things to do. They should always be done. Background investigations, also criminal investigations, but sometimes they're inconclusive.
I made a very good living for a quarter of a century exploiting ambiguities in FBI 302
Yes,
reports. So
of course.
we know they're imperfect. But
Not always, because sometimes you get. Look, that's how prosecutors make decisions, right? The first thing you do is you conduct an investigation. Then you make a decision about whether or not there's enough to charge or if it serves the interest of justice to bring a charge. And sometimes it's a strong case and sometimes it's a less strong case. It has to be above a certain threshold. And, one of my worries is if you're a partisan and you think one thing, you support Kavanaugh, or you're someone who doesn't support Kavanaugh because you care about the court. I mean, this is a problem, I think, generally about the rule of law, that you haven't asked about it. We always talk about what the president does, and does he undermine, notions of the rule of law and what the courts do. But, the public plays some role in this as well, right? And maybe they're not conditioned properly, but what bothers me is there's lots and lots of folks in the country who are well-meaning and believe in things, outside of their own self-interest, but they care about certain policies. They want to elect a particular person, and they are quick to substitute their own political preferences for the judgment of law enforcement or what might be true. So you have chance of lock her up by people who don't know what the investigation shows, don't know what the law is with respect to the email server that Hillary Clinton had, but what they know is they don't want her to become president. So they chant lock her up. There are people on the other side that don't quite chant lock him up, but they believe, even though they haven't seen the files in the Mueller office, a week after that investigation started, who think, he's guilty of a crime, he should go to prison. And similarly now, there are a lot of people on both sides of the spectrum who believe 100% that things happen in a particular way and 100% the otherwise, and or they're saying those things because what they're really thinking, and I find this unfortunate because of how sort of polarized we all are, they're not separating those two things. Like, what does the evidence show, and what do I want to have happen to this nomination? And that's a thing that I think is exacerbated by the president and makes it worse.
Exactly what I was going to ask you. Turning now to the Department of Justice, the president's attacks on Attorney General Sessions, on Rod Rosenstein, who we both know well. I've known him for 25 years, and on Bob Mueller. I've worked, like you, worked a lot with Bob. What do you make of the president's attacks on DOJ, Sessions, Mueller, the FBI, Rosenstein, and what effect is that having on the rule of law, and what's the long-term effect of that likely to be?
Yeah, so terrible. Speaking of the hurricane, like that sort of that's sort of like the threatening part of the hurricane. Like, are these things going to come to pass? Is he going to fire Sessions? Is he going to fire Rosenstein? Is he going to indirectly find some way to fire Mueller? If all those things come to pass, then I think the hurricane has arrived, and it's at 5.
You think if Sessions is fired,
I think
Rosenstein
he
is
figures out
fired?
a way to shut down the Mueller investigation, which can't fully be shut down for reasons we can discuss. Yeah, we're at a 5. I just don't know if that's happening. And there's lots of folks trying to convince the president not to bring the hurricane back, to shore. So there are two things happening there, right? One is it affecting the rule of law? Now, I think so long as the hurricane doesn't come back, now we're beating this analogy to death, people are doing their jobs, right? People that you and I both know who work for Special Counsel Mueller, and we know Mueller, they're keeping their heads down. I don't believe they're leaking. They're interviewing people. They're collecting evidence. They always put them together in incredibly detailed, smart indictments and charges. And
Bob is not a leaker. You can't
not.
You can't even get him to tell you what's going on when you're sitting in a meeting with him, much
Right.
less on background.
I totally agree with that. So they're doing their job. I think Rosenstein's doing his job. So to the extent people are permitted to do their job, notwithstanding sort of a swirling threat above them, I think the rule of law is okay. I think, however, going back to an earlier point, to the extent the president tries to undermine the people who are looking at him and his associates, that undermines the rule of law because it undermines people's faith in what the ultimate result would be. So I have tried to say from the beginning, although that gets lost and never gets reported and people don't pay attention, that I will abide by whatever the ultimate result of the Mueller investigation is, right? So if he decides to write in a report that makes it look like the president has committed 80 high crimes and misdemeanors, I will respect that. I will believe that. If, on the other hand, and not everyone will, right? And so his reputation, depending on, what people think, politically and how they interpret the evidence from newspaper leaks, is something different, right? But on the other hand, if he decides there's no obstruction, there's no credible allegation of X, Y, or Z that people are talking about and speculating about, I will accept that too, because that's what you have to do. My worry is that depending on where you sit, you might not feel that way, and part of the reason is the president has done a pretty good job of undermining the integrity of the people who are working on the investigation and the constant repetition of witch hunt, attacking Bob Mueller, who's a war veteran, a war hero. It has an effect among the base, and it's not unrelated to maybe the most insidious thing the president does that doesn't violate any law, and that is to undermine. When we talk about the press, so the press I think is free, and the libel laws are not going to be changed, but to undermine what the truth is. People talk about that as something separate from rule of law. It's not. If you undermine what the truth is, and so people think that such a thing as fake news or such a thing as alternative facts, and you never know what to believe. And if the president says it didn't happen, even though you have it on tape, you believe it didn't happen, that also affects this other stuff we're talking about, right? The rule of law. Because at the end of the day, faith in decisions made by prosecutors matters, because it also affects the degree to which future prosecutors decide to bring a case or not bring a case. And so the legitimacy, it's not just what Bob Mueller determines, because we live in a democracy, and these things matter, right? What is going to matter also is what the public reaction to that is. And it seems like Trump has already primed a lot of folks, to the extent something negative comes out, to not believe it.
How do we repair? You've pointed to erosion, hurricane damage on every part of the political spectrum as a result of some of the fights we've had relating to the rule of law. In this moment when there is a profound challenge on multiple fronts to the rule of law, how do we repair the damage? Some of that you talk about in your new report, legislative and other solutions. But how do we fix what's broken with public confidence in the rule of law?
So I think one thing you need is a check and a balance. You should not have a supine Congress. I worked in the Senate Judiciary Committee for 4.5 years. I worked on the Supreme Court nominations of John Roberts and Sam Alito. But the other thing I did was work in a bipartisan way on an investigation into the politicization of things at the Justice Department and the firing, ironically, the firing of U.S. attorneys back in 2006, which we investigated in 2007. And the gavel changed hands between 2006 and 2007, so it became a slight majority Democratic Senate. And there were all these things that seemed to be going on at the Justice Department, and I was the lead staff investigator for it, but we did it jointly, Senator Schumer's subcommittee, along with Arlen Specter, and we investigated. And we looked at a lot of things. We found out that the bad practices were happening at the Department of Justice. A lot of people resigned. But at least you had some oversight, and it was credible oversight, because we didn't issue a subpoena. We didn't, engage in a certain order of witnesses. We didn't ask for documents unless it was done on a bipartisan basis. Senator Specter's staff and Senator Schumer's staff that I led at the time. And so if Congress changes, now, by the way, it doesn't have to happen that way. Members of the same party are permitted. There's no law against members of the same party investigating and overseeing the conduct of people who are in a similar party who are in the administration. That has not happened because everyone in Congress, I think, has some fear of doing anything that's going to bother the President of the United States. And you have, a chairman like Devin Nunes. Is he going to be at this thing? I don't mean to offend him if he's going to be there.
We invited both the chairs and the ranking members of all three of the critical committees of jurisdiction in the House. Unfortunately, we were not able to secure RSVPs from the chairs. We do have all the ranking members.
If I would make a suggestion to those folks who may have the gavel, come January, there's a model for doing this, right? You get together with the ranking member and don't do things the way that I think the Intelligence Committee has been working so far. Mike Rogers was the Republican chair of the Intelligence Committee. My recollection of things was, and my sense of it, and from what I read, was the Intelligence Committee, above all other committees, was conducted in a bipartisan way, because intelligence is more important than party. It shouldn't be about, settling scores or protecting a particular president. There's going to be a lot of things to investigate. So in answer to your question, the first thing that we can do to improve people's understanding of the rule of law and to bring back the rule of law is for there to be a legitimate, weighty check, part of which will be through these committees that have oversight authority over the presidency. But I would caution folks, not to sort of swing back in the other direction. I don't think they will, and I know some of them, to swing back in the other direction and say, well, now we have the gavel, and now we're going to subpoena everyone for everything, no matter what. I think people need to be smart and think about the things that are most fundamental to, how our constitutional democracy is supposed to operate. But then also look at a lot of the petty corruption and what I believe to be, based on the resignations that have already happened and based on the reporting that we've already seen, all sorts of terrible corruption, waste, fraud, and abuse at all these agencies. That's what I would be doing, because one of the things I think that undermines the rule of law and undermines people's faith in democracy is corruption. And people ripping off the public by taking private planes from two nearby cities, from one nearby city to another nearby city. That's terrible for how people think about their government. And I think, honor and integrity and ethics, those all mean something. And so the one thing to be done is to show, I think, an administration that the country cares about it and the Congress cares about it, and the Congress is going to investigate and expose things that show that it's not being done the right way. And not only has the swamp not been drained, it's been slowly filling over the last year and a half.
I do want to point out that the Senate, where you've worked, the Senate Intelligence Committee with Senators Burr and Warner, has worked along that model. It has been very different in the House. And how will, when you have people of the majority party who have evidently not acted in good faith over the past 2 years, have not done oversight, and have, to be candid, have enabled some of the worst instincts of Donald Trump on the rule of law. How can you work with those individuals, whether they're the chair or they become the ranking members? How's it even possible?
I don't know. I think it probably takes a lot of skill. I think Adam Schiff has those skills. I know him a little bit, and I think he's an excellent. He's not only a good congressman, he's a former prosecutor, and I think that informs how he goes about doing his work. Look, the concern I have, that I think should be resisted by people like Adam Schiff if they get the gavel, is that when Devin Nunes and others have violated all the norms and acted in a particular way and tried to declassify things and give a false impression of how the FISA court works or what the FISA application said in connection with some of the people in the Mueller investigation, I think I said at the time, people need to be careful, because people will have one day the other side will be in the majority, and they will say that there's a precedent for engaging this kind of conduct. I would hope and think you can still be an effective check. You can still expose waste, fraud, and abuse. You can still protect the country. You can still make sure that the intelligence community gets what it needs and the public is as safe as it can be by not stooping to the level that I think some of the current chairs of these committees have stooped to.
Two last things.
Yeah.
You have a book coming out. Tell us all what it's about.
Coming out,
I know.
The
The fact
definition
that
of-
you're here with me now, you should be editing your book, Preet.
So I have a draft done, and it's my view, based on experience and overseeing cases for a number of years on how justice is delivered. It's not for lawyers; it's for everybody. It's a little bit of a reflection on, what's going on in our time without talking about the things that are going on in our time. Sometimes the way you address current problems is by going back to first principles. What is justice? What is fairness? What does it mean to keep an open mind? What does it mean to have bias? What is appropriate punishment? All sort of the eternal questions of how you engage in inquiry and hold people accountable for things, whether it's in a court of law or it's in a congressional committee or it's at a company or at a university. I sort of want to address, have us take a step back and realize that we are a nation of laws, sure, but those laws are enforced by human beings, and unless we train and help educate the people who are in charge of enforcing and interpreting the laws, it doesn't matter how good your laws are. So it's more focused on how people can do the right thing and avoid doing the wrong thing.
What's it called?
The title, we're still working on the
work
title.
in
It's not a
pro-
catchy title. It's not a catchy title.
A work in progress. And
Yes.
when's it out?
So it depends on how the editing goes. I'm hoping it'll be out in the spring.
Are you optimistic about the future of American democracy?
I am, with caveats. Look, when anything bad happens, we focus on all the bad stuff, but it also sheds light on the other side of the coin, right? So I was in New York during 9/11, as a lot of people were, and it was like the worst thing you ever saw in your life, and hopefully the worst thing I will ever see in my life. But then you also saw heroism, and you also saw outpouring, and you also saw unity, before which there had been division. It didn't always last, but then that gives you hope. So I think in all bad things happening, you have to find hope. I'm very hopeful that a bunch of Democrats and Republicans got together, to join Christy Todd Whitman and me, to try to come up with practical solutions to save our democracy. I think journalism provides me with some sense of optimism, and people are sort of, I think, spending more time focusing on what's important. I think there are a new wave of young people entering politics. After the massacre at Parkland, devastating, horrible, tragic, unspeakable. But you know what? I still have hope, because you see these young kids who are coming out of that tragedy, who are involving themselves and getting other people to get involved and thinking about sensible solutions to our problems. So, I'm very heartened by the fact that lots and lots of good people are paying a lot more attention. I have a podcast. I'm a former prosecutor, dull guy. But hundreds of thousands of people listen. So you get that nice plug I did for the podcast. Stay tuned.
We got the report
Did you
plug.
get
We got the book
the
plug.
book plug?
Now
We're
the
all
podcast
set.
plug.
Thank you, Norm.
This is many commercials as when we're on CNN together, Preet.
But my point is, I think a lot of people are listening, like they listen to folks from the Brookings Institute and Ben Wittes, because people are so interested in understand. Everyone is terrified and scared, doesn't know what's going on, and they feel a little bit better if they can understand how Congress works, if they can understand how the rule of law works, and how evidentiary rules work, what an investigation is, why you put people under oath, what the order of things is, what does it mean to flip a witness, how much evidence is. Everyone's getting a civic education right now on how the world is supposed to work, and so they're listening to lawyers like you and me, because there's a hunger for wanting to know why things are happening, how things can be made better, and what they can do about it.
Thank you, Preet.
Thank you.
We appreciate you being here
Thanks,
with
Norm.
us.